Lonely rancher saved the blind girl, was ridiculed in town, but instead of rejecting her, he gave her his name. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It was the year 1878. The trading post stood at the edge of the New Mexico desert like a spar carved into the earth. Sun-baked boards leaned against one another, the roof sagged inward, and a corral stood half-collapsed under the weight of neglect. This was not a place people visited for pleasure. It was a place born of necessity, where two worlds met under tension, the settlers and the Apache. Jonathan Hale had come there that morning. He needed nails, a new whetstone, and sacks of flour. Winter had thinned his stores, and his tools were worn to the bone. He owned a stretch of dry land outside the valley, where a modest wooden house stood alone against the wide horizon. Jonathan had raised those walls with his own hands. The place carried the smell of cedar, the bite of smoke, and the quiet that comes only to men who live far from company. He did not linger in conversation. His words were few, shaped by loss. Years before, raiders had taken from him what was most dear, his wife and young son. Since then, silence had been his armor. Questions from others only reopened wounds he could not close, so he avoided people altogether. That morning, however, the post was crowded. The Apaches had come for tobacco, whiskey, iron pots, and cartridges. Their chief was a towering figure with eyes sharp as obsidian, a man who enjoyed pushing boundaries, testing the patience of settlers, stirring unease like coals in a dying fire. Jonathan remained near the back wall, arms crossed, observing without comment. He was used to waiting. He was used to being overlooked. Among the Apaches stood Elena, the chief's daughter, but not his favored one. Years earlier, a horse had thrown her, shattering her leg. Later, an infection clouded one of her eyes. At 24, she walked with a limp, her sight half-dimmed. In her own people's eyes, she was little more than a burden. She knew the whispers, felt the sting of pity and the sharper sting of contempt. She had learned to keep her face still, unreadable, though inside she carried the weight of shame. The negotiation at the counter dragged on, voices sharp, laughter edged with cruelty. Then, with sudden motion, the chief shoved Elena forward. His voice rang out with scorn. "She is lame and blind, useless to us. Perhaps the rancher will have her. He has no wife. Two broken ones together." Nervous laughter followed from some of the settlers, crueler laughter from others. Elena's chest tightened, heat rose in her cheeks. This was the day she had feared, the day she would be used as nothing more than a joke. Jonathan's expression did not change, but within him something stirred. He saw the torn fabric at her shoulder, the way she shifted her weight to ease the pain in her bad leg, the firm line of her jaw as she endured the mockery. A dense, quiet anger welled up inside him. He knew what it was to be scorned, to be left hollow by others' cruelty. The chief expected laughter or quick rejection. That was the joke. Instead, Jonathan's voice broke the silence, low, steady, resolute. "I'll take her." The laughter died at once. Even the settlers who had joined in fell silent. Surprise darkened the chief's face. Elena's stomach knotted. She had never believed anyone would accept her. Her first thought was fear. What would this man do with her? Men were rarely kind, least of all to women marked as weak. She braced herself for the worst. Jonathan stepped forward. His hand came to her arm, not harsh, not claiming, but firm enough to guide. She tensed, torn between resisting and yielding. Yet his grip was steady, respectful, without possession. The crowd parted as he led her toward the wagon. Boots scuffed against the dirt, tobacco spit hit the ground, whispers trailed behind them. Some muttered confusion, others spat bitterness. Jonathan said nothing. He only walked. Behind them, the jeers of the trading post faded into the wind of the desert. The wagon creaked as Jonathan helped Elena climb aboard. His hand, rough from years of labor, steadied her without pressing, and once she sat, he released her as if careful not to cage her. She sank into the seat with a rigid back, her heart beating too fast. He took the reins and flicked them lightly. The horses moved forward, hooves striking the dry ground in rhythm, wheels groaning over ruts carved by years of travel. They left the trading post behind. Dust rose in their wake, and the laughter of men who had mocked her thinned into the wind until only silence remained. Elena sat with her hands clasped in her lap, every muscle taut. She expected questions, demands, perhaps even cruelty. But Jonathan said nothing. His eyes stayed on the horizon, his jaw locked, his beard untrimmed and sun-worn. He was a man shaped by work, his silence neither boastful nor cruel. That silence unsettled her more than jeers might have. It was heavy, yet not mocking, different. She stole a glance with her one good eye. His shirt sleeves were rolled, his forearms lined with scars and the strength of daily labor. He looked neither at her nor away from her, only forward. Her mind spun with questions. Why did he accept? What did he expect from her? Fear whispered answers she did not want to believe. She had seen men's hunger before, had heard their laughter when she limped past. Yet his gaze had not lowered, not even once. The desert stretched wide around them. Dry gullies cut the earth, thorned shrubs dotted the plain, and the sun bled orange against the sky. Coyotes cried far in the distance. The land was vast, indifferent, a reminder of how small they both were in the frontier's unforgiving reach. The wagon jolted over a stone. Pain shot through her bad leg, and she let out a sharp breath. Jonathan glanced at her, then back at the horses. Without a word, he eased the reins, slowing the pace so the ride shook less. The small act startled her more than cruelty would have. Men she had known before had never slowed for her, never softened their stride. She bit back the heat in her eyes, unwilling to show weakness. As the miles stretched, the rhythm of hooves filled the silence. The sun sank lower, shadows stretching long. The air cooled, carrying the scent of pine from distant ridges. At last she spoke, her voice low, uncertain. Where are you taking me?" He did not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, his voice a deep, quiet rumble. "To my land, away from the town. You'll be safe there." The words struck her strangely. Safe. No one had used it for her in years. She turned her gaze back to the horizon, her thoughts tangled between disbelief and a fragile, unsteady thread of hope. The wagon pressed on, the desert opening wide before them. Neither spoke again, yet something unspoken settled in the space between them, a beginning neither had planned, but neither could now escape. To continue this adventure, please subscribe to our channel. It helps us keep creating. The wagon lurched forward as Jonathan Hale snapped the reins, the horses pulling them into the fading light of the desert. Dust rose behind them in a thin veil, carrying with it the last echoes of laughter from the trading post. Elena sat stiff on the wooden bench, her hands locked together in her lap, her one good eye fixed on the ground rushing beneath the wheels. Her heart pounded. Every breath felt like a countdown to the cruelty she was certain would come. Jonathan said nothing. His silence pressed into the space between them, not sharp like her father's taunts, not cutting like the settler's jeers, but heavy, unreadable. He looked straight ahead, shoulders squared, jaw set beneath a rough beard touched with gray. To Elena, the silence was harder to endure than words might have been. Words, at least, could be fought. Silence left her trapped with her own doubts. The desert opened wide around them. Dry gullies cut across the earth. Thorned mesquite and sage stood like ragged sentinels, and the sky burned with the orange of the setting sun. The land itself seemed to mock her fragility. She shifted, trying to ease the throb in her bad leg, but the wagon struck a rut and pain jolted through her. A small gasp escaped her lips before she could choke it back. Jonathan's head turned briefly, eyes catching her in a glance that was sharp but not prying. He pulled gently at the reins, slowing the horses. The wagon's jolt softened, the rhythm of the ride easing. Then he returned his gaze to the horizon as though the adjustment meant nothing. Elena stared at him, bewildered. Men had never slowed their stride for her. They had laughed when she stumbled, sneered when she struggled. To be accommodated, even in so small a way, was a thing foreign to her. She turned her face back to the desert, unwilling to let him see the sting rising in her eyes. The road stretched endless ahead, fading into the darkening horizon. Coyotes howled from some unseen ridge, their cries carried on the dry wind. The sound clawed at her nerves, reminding her of nights she had cowered outside the warmth of the fire, unwanted among her own people. Still, Jonathan said nothing. His silence pressed, yet she began to sense it was not the silence of mockery, but of a man who had grown used to carrying weight alone. She stole another glance at him, the steady hands on the reins, the scar that traced his forearm, the way he kept his distance without retreating from her presence. At last, unable to bear it, she forced words through her tight throat. Where are you taking me?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her. Then, his voice came low, deep, carrying a steadiness that startled her. "To my land, away from the town. You'll be safe there." The word safe struck her like a stone dropped into still water. It rippled through her chest, strange, unfamiliar. Safe. No one had spoken it over her in years. She clutched her hands tighter, not daring to believe, yet unable to deny the flicker of warmth that crept into her guarded heart. The wagon pressed on. The desert fell into shadow, the sky deepened into violet, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of hooves and wheels carrying them into the unknown. The last light of day clung to the horizon when the cabin came into view. It stood on a rise beyond a thin line of pines, its walls squared against the wind, chimney breathing a faint thread of smoke. To Elena's eyes, it looked less like a home than a fortress of solitude, a place built to keep the world out. Jonathan brought the wagon to a halt. He climbed down, boots sinking into the dirt, and turned to offer his hand. She hesitated, suspicion tightening her chest. His palm waited without pressure, steady, patient. Finally, she placed her fingers in his. His grip was firm, guiding her down, then gone as soon as her feet touched the ground. The release startled her as much as the touch. Men rarely let go so easily. The cabin door groaned open. Inside, the air carried the scent of cedar and smoke. Walls of rough-hewn boards bore the marks of years of labor, patched and reinforced with care. Tools hung in perfect rows, saws, hammers, chisels, each placed as if it belonged to a ritual order. A table stood at the center with two plain chairs. On the shelves, jars of beans and cornmeal lined up beside candles stubbed from use. Elena's gaze drifted higher, landing on a book resting on a shelf above the hearth. Its leather cover was worn soft, the spine cracked with years of use. A thin ribbon marked a place within, a Bible. Her breath caught, not because she had never seen one, but because of the way it was kept, as though it was more than paper, as though it was alive in the room. Jonathan lit a lamp, setting it on the table. Its glow fell against the wooden walls, softening the austerity. He moved without wasted motion, setting bread on the table, pouring water into tin cups. Not once did he speak. Drawn by something beyond herself, Elena turned toward the window. Through the glass, across the slope of land, she saw a small wooden cross planted on a rise. The evening wind stirred around it, bending the grass. She knew without asking what lay beneath it: graves. The silence around Jonathan was no longer a puzzle, it was grief. Her throat tightened. For a moment, she felt the echo of her own abandonment. Two broken lives, under one roof, bound by different wounds, but the same silence. Jonathan's voice came, quiet but firm. "The bed is yours." He nodded toward the corner, where a narrow frame stood covered with folded blankets. "I'll take the floor." Elena froze. She had been bracing for the worst, and now this, an offer she had never received from any man? Dignity, where she had only known disgrace. A verse stirred in her memory, words she had once heard from a missionary long ago, words now glowing in the lamplight like a whisper. "I will never leave you nor forsake you." Hebrews 13:5. The scripture hung in her heart as she lowered herself onto the chair. For the first time in years, the night ahead did not feel like a sentence. It felt like a possibility. Outside, the coyotes called to the rising moon. But within the cedar walls, another kind of silence took root, one that offered space instead of scorn. The first mornings passed in silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin bowls. Jonathan sat opposite Elena at the small table, shoulders bowed over his food. He never rushed, never looked too long, never offered more words than necessity. The quiet pressed in around them, heavier than the walls of the cabin. Elena chewed slowly, suspicion bitter on her tongue. Men had never given without taking. She waited for the moment the price would be named, for the demand hidden behind his silence. Her father had mocked her openly, others had mocked her in whispers. Jonathan's silence was harder to judge. It could have been patience, or it could have been a trap. Outside, the days stretched long. Jonathan split wood at dawn, sawdust clinging to his boots, the sound of the axe striking steady as a clock. He tended to chores with practiced rhythm, every movement efficient, his face unreadable. Elena watched from the doorway, leaning on the frame for balance, her legs stiff in the chill air. She told herself she studied him for signs of danger, but part of her simply could not look away. When she tried to move about the cabin, her limp betrayed her. Each step sent pain knifing up her side. She gritted her teeth, willing herself to show no weakness. But Jonathan noticed. He noticed everything. One evening, he lingered by the fire longer than usual, eyes flicking once to her as she shifted uncomfortably on the hard chair. The next day, when she entered the room, a small stool sat near the hearth. Made of pine, sanded smooth, its edges rounded by care. He did not mention it. He only placed it there, as though it had always belonged. Elena stared at it, suspicion warring with weariness. Slowly, she lowered herself onto it. Relief spread through her leg, the pain easing, and with it, a wave of confusion. She lifted her gaze, but Jonathan was already at the table, sharpening his knife against a whetstone. No smile, no acknowledgement, no words. Only that single act, done without asking, done without fanfare. Her chest tightened. It was easier to endure cruelty than kindness. Cruelty was familiar. This carved piece of wood that spoke louder than words, was dangerous. It tempted her to believe in things she had long buried. Dignity, worth, the chance that she might not be a burden forever. That night, as she lay on the bed while Jonathan stretched out on the floor near the stove, she stared at the ceiling beams. The scent of cedar filled her lungs. Every creak of the fire seemed to echo the same question in her chest. Why? Why had he slowed the horses when her leg hurt? Why had he given her the bed? Why the stool? Jonathan turned in his sleep, the floor creaking under his weight. She shut her eyes quickly, as though afraid he might read the questions if he looked at her. Sleep did not come easily. The stool's presence in the room weighed heavier than chains, because it was not a symbol of possession, it was a symbol of care, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. On the fourth morning, Elena rose before Jonathan. The cabin was still cloaked in the gray of early dawn, the fire only embers. She sat up slowly, her legs stiff, the ache constant. For a long moment she remained on the edge of the bed, debating whether it was worth the pain. Then she pushed herself upright. She would not be a shadow in this house. Her hands found a broom leaning against the wall. She began to sweep, clumsy at first, the uneven floorboards catching the bristles. Dust stirred in the dim light, her breath quickening with effort. Each movement sent sparks of pain through her bad leg, but she pressed on. She had been called useless too many times. Not here. Not again. By the time Jonathan came in from splitting wood, she had filled a pot with beans, water drawn from the barrel outside. The fire popped as the pot began to simmer. She stirred with a wooden spoon, her hand trembling but steady enough to keep the beans from sticking. Jonathan paused at the threshold, the cold still clinging to his coat. His eyes fell on the pot, then on her. For a heartbeat, he said nothing. Then he stepped past her and set the wood down. That night, she tried sewing. One of his shirts lay across her lap, its seams frayed from years of wear. The needle pricked her fingers, drawing tiny beads of blood, but she pushed on, clumsy stitches biting into the fabric. Her eyes strained in the lamplight, but she refused to quit. By the time Jonathan returned from the shed, the shirt lay folded on the table, its seam awkward but whole. He picked it up, studied the uneven stitches. His expression did not change, but he laid the shirt carefully aside as though it mattered. He sat to eat, the gesture small but enough for her chest to tighten. The next day, she carried a small bucket of water from the well. Each step jarred her leg, the weight nearly tipping her sideways. She clenched her teeth, refusing to call for help. When she stumbled at the doorway, the bucket sloshed, water spilling across the threshold. Jonathan appeared behind her, catching the handle before it slipped. His hand covered hers briefly, then released once the bucket was steady. He set it down without a word and moved back to his tools. Elena's breath shuddered out. No scolding, no mocking, just a simple act to keep her from falling. That evening, as they sat to eat the beans she had cooked, the silence stretched as always. But when Jonathan lifted his spoon and ate without complaint, a knot in her chest loosened. He looked up once, met her gaze, and gave a single nod. Nothing more. The nod struck harder than praise, harder than laughter, harder than any of the jeers she had carried. It said, "I see you." And for the first time in her life, Elena felt as though her hands, her work, and her presence had weight in the world. The fire snapped and hissed as the beans simmered in their pot. Shadows stretched long across the cabin walls, bending and swaying with each flicker of the flame. Elena sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, eyes drawn to the dance of light more than to the food before her. The silence had grown familiar, but tonight it pressed heavier, like a weight waiting to break. At last she spoke. Her voice was low, almost lost in the crackle of the fire. "Why did you take me?" Jonathan's spoon paused halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, his hand steady, his gaze fixed on the fire. For a long moment she thought he would not answer. Then his voice came, low and firm. "Because your father wanted to shame us both. I wasn't going to give him that." The words struck her chest like a hammer. Simple, unadorned, but they cut through years of mockery. She blinked hard, refusing to let the heat in her eyes spill over. No one had ever defended her, not against her father, not against anyone. Jonathan picked up his spoon again, as if nothing had been said. Elena stared at him, searching for some flicker of pride or satisfaction in his expression, but found none. It was not a boast, only truth. The silence deepened once more, broken only by the sound of spoons against bowls. Then Jonathan did something she had not expected. He lowered his head, eyes closed, hands resting against the edge of the table. His lips moved quietly, words too soft to catch, yet their shape was unmistakable, a prayer. Elena froze. She had seen white men drink, fight, curse, and mock, but prayer was rare. Reverence rarer still. She watched him as though he were a creature from another world. When he lifted his head again, he only reached for his bread, tearing it with rough hands, no explanation offered. Her voice broke into the quiet again, softer now. "You lost them, didn't you?" He stilled, his eyes lifting to hers at last. The firelight caught in them, revealing weight she had not seen before. He gave one small nod, nothing more. Her chest constricted. She remembered the graves on the hill, the cross bending in the wind. His silence was not emptiness, it was mourning. A silence she knew too well, though hers was born from rejection, his from loss. Two silences meeting in one small cabin. For the first time, she felt the edge of something like kinship. Not trust, not yet, but a thread binding them in sorrow. The fire burned lower. Jonathan leaned back, folding his arms, his gaze resting on the flames. Elena's eye lingered on him, unsettled by the steady presence that asked nothing of her, demanded nothing in return. She did not know whether to fear it or to lean into it. That night, as she lay on the bed, she whispered words she had not dared to speak in years. Not a prayer, not exactly, only a hope. Don't leave me like the others did." From the floor near the stove, Jonathan stirred in his sleep, turning over with a sigh. The cabin fell quiet once more, but the silence no longer felt quite the same. The night wind pushed against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. Inside, the fire burned low, casting an amber glow across the cabin. Elena moved carefully across the floor, carrying a folded blanket toward the chest near the wall. Her leg dragged, stiff from the day's work. Halfway across the room, her foot caught on the uneven plank. Pain shot through her as her bad leg buckled. The blanket slipped from her hands, and for a brief, terrifying moment, she felt herself falling. Then Jonathan was there. His hand caught her arm, firm and steady, the strength of his grip holding her upright. He did not pull her close, nor restrain her. He simply kept her from falling. She froze, her breath caught in her chest. His hand remained on her arm a moment longer than necessary, and in that pause, something shifted. Her gaze lifted to his. The firelight reflected in his eyes, steady, watchful, not mocking, not hungry, something else. Slowly, almost without thought, she lifted her hand and pressed it against his chest. The coarse fabric of his shirt was warm beneath her palm, and beneath it the rhythm of his heartbeat, strong, steady, alive. The sound filled her ears, drowning the silence that had defined her life for so long. Jonathan did not move at first. Then, carefully, as though testing ground that might give way beneath his feet, he bent his head. His lips hovered close, giving her every chance to turn away. Elena's pulse raced. Every instinct told her to retreat, to protect herself, but she did not move. When his lips brushed hers, the touch was light, almost reverent, not claiming, not demanding, a question, not an answer. She inhaled sharply, her hand pressing firmer against his chest as though to anchor herself. The kiss lingered only a moment before he drew back, his hand releasing her arm. Silence rushed in again, but this silence was not empty. It was full, thick with the weight of what had just passed. Elena stood motionless, her breath unsteady, lips tingling with the memory of his. She had been kissed before, but never like this. Never with patience, never without expectation. Jonathan stepped back, his jaw tight, eyes shadowed by firelight. He reached down, lifted the blanket she had dropped, and handed it back to her. His hand brushed hers as she took it, a fleeting contact that left her fingers trembling. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say. Words would have broken the fragile thing forming between them. Later, as Elena lay in the bed, her hand drifted to her lips. She closed her eye, replaying the moment in her mind. The warmth of his chest, the steadiness of his hand, the gentleness of the kiss. For the first time in years, fear did not grip her as she closed her eyes. Instead, a fragile hope spread through her like the first stirrings of spring after a long winter. On the floor near the stove, Jonathan lay awake longer than usual, staring at the ceiling beams. He had not meant for it to happen, but he did not regret it. In the silence between them, something new had taken root, delicate, uncertain, but alive. The journey to explore the Wild West is still long. Subscribe to hear more true stories. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments. Winter pressed hard against the cabin. The world outside was white and still, snow piled high against the doorframe, pines bent beneath the weight. Each morning Jonathan rose before dawn, his axe breaking the silence of the frozen air. The steady rhythm, strike, crack, fall, echoed across the hollow like the beat of a great clock marking survival. Inside, Elena moved slowly, tending the fire, her legs stiff and aching in the cold. She swept the floor with the small broom, folded their blankets, and kept beans simmering over the flames. Each task was humble, but in them she found a strange new steadiness, as if the walls of the cabin held her together. Jonathan carried wood inside, boots thudding, frost clinging to his beard. He said little, as always, but she began to see more in his silence than emptiness. His eyes lingered when she winced with pain, his hand steady when he handed her a bucket or knife. Still, she told herself not to hope. Hope had betrayed her before. One evening, as the fire dimmed low, Jonathan carried something new into the cabin, a chair. He set it down by the hearth without a word. Elena blinked, startled. It was simple, crafted of pine, but sturdy. The seat was lower than usual, the arms broad and smooth, the legs angled to bear weight evenly. She stared, not understanding at first. Then the truth struck her. It had been made for her leg, for her comfort. Not out of pity, but out of deliberate care. Her throat tightened. Slowly, she lowered herself into it. For the first time in years, she sat without pain stabbing her side. Relief spread through her body, but with it came something more dangerous, the ache of being seen. Jonathan busied himself at the table, wiping wood shavings from his hands, his back turned as though it were nothing. He offered no words, no explanation. Elena's fingers curled against the smooth pine, tracing the edges where his knife had shaped it. Her mind spun. No one had ever built something for her. No one had ever thought her worth the effort. She swallowed hard, eyes burning with heat she refused to let fall. When Jonathan finally looked her way, it was only for a heartbeat. Their eyes met, and then he turned back to his work. But in that heartbeat, something shifted. The chair was not just wood and nails. It was proof. Proof that she was not invisible. Proof that she had a place here, even if she dared not name it. As she leaned back into the chair, warmth spread through her chest, not from the fire, but from the knowledge that, in this house, at least one man in the world had seen her brokenness and chosen to honor it. Outside, the wind howled across the white fields. Inside, for the first time in her life, Elena sat in comfort made by another's hands. The snow outside muted every sound, the world hushed under its heavy white cloak. Inside, the fire gave off a steady glow, filling the cabin with warmth and shadows that danced along the walls. Jonathan sat at the table sharpening a blade, the rasp of stone against steel the only sound apart from the crackle of the fire. Elena sat across from him, mending one of his shirts. Her stitches were still uneven, but steadier than before. Each thrust of the needle gave her something to hold on to, a rhythm against the silence. Yet her thoughts pressed harder than the cold. She had felt the comfort of the chair he built, the relief of not being treated as a burden. Still, fear gnawed at her. Winter would not last forever. When spring came, when the roads opened and people returned to the land, what would he do? Would he keep her, or would he let her go, cast her out as easily as her father had? The words rose before she could stop them. Her voice was low, trembling, yet sharp with the weight of years. "When the snow melts, will you send me away?" Jonathan's hand stilled on the blade. For a long moment, only the fire moved. Then he lifted his head. His gaze met hers, steady, unflinching, carrying a gravity that seemed carved into him by years of silence and loss. "I don't take someone in to cast them out," he said at last, voice low but firm. The words fell heavy, landing deep in her chest. She clenched the fabric in her hands, afraid to breathe, afraid to believe. "You mean that?" she whispered. His eyes softened only a fraction, but his jaw stayed set. "I do." Elena's throat ached. She lowered her gaze quickly, not wanting him to see the tears threatening to spill. For so long she had braced for rejection, for the moment when kindness would sour into cruelty. But here, under this roof, in the flickering firelight, the promise rang true. She stitched in silence, her hands trembling, the shirt blurred by the sting in her eyes. Across the table, Jonathan returned to his blade, the rasp steady once more. Yet the room no longer felt cold with silence. His words lingered like warmth in the air, heavier than the fire's glow. Later, when she lay in the bed and he stretched on the floor by the stove, she stared into the shadows. The fear had not vanished, not fully, but his vow echoed again and again. "I don't take someone in to cast them out." It was not a declaration of love, it was not flowery or soft, but it was enough to steady her heart against the storm of doubt. And for Elena, that was more precious than any promise she had ever known. The storm outside raged fierce that night. Snow swept across the land in endless sheets, striking the windows with icy fingers. Inside the cabin, the fire roared against the cold, filling the room with a glow that felt almost fragile against the weight of winter pressing in. Elena moved carefully, her limp more pronounced after a day of work. She carried a small pot from the hearth to the table, her hand steady despite the ache in her leg. Halfway across the room, her balance faltered. The pot tipped dangerously. Before she could cry out, Jonathan's hand was there, steadying both her and the pot in one swift motion. For a moment, his grip did not release. His hand rested over hers, warm and sure. She lifted her gaze, and his eyes met hers in the flickering light. Neither moved, the silence filled only by the rhythm of the fire. Jonathan set the pot safely down. But he did not step away. Instead, his hand brushed against hers again, slower this time, deliberate. Elena's heart hammered. She had lived her life expecting cruelty or indifference, never this, never a pause, heavy with something unspoken. He reached, not with force, but with quiet intent, fingers lifting to her cheek. She trembled, caught between fear and a longing she had buried. Then, with a patience she had never known, Jonathan bent his head. His lips touched hers, firm, steady, protective. It was not a demand, not a claim. It was a shelter. Her breath caught. For an instant, the world beyond the cabin vanished. There was only the fire, the press of his hand, and the startling realization that she was not despised in his eyes. When he pulled back, the silence thickened, but it was no longer empty. She reached for words, but Jonathan spoke first, his voice rough as though dragged from deep within. "I know what it is," he said, eyes fixed on the fire. "To lose everything. To have the world look at you as though you should have been buried with what you lost." Elena's chest tightened. She remembered the cross on the hill, the graves marked by wood and silence. The truth lay bare now, not in detail, but in weight. His silence had not been coldness, it was grief, the kind she recognized in herself. Her hand, trembling, rose to rest against his chest. His heartbeat thudded steady beneath her palm, a rhythm that spoke louder than any vow. For the first time, she felt not discarded, not pitied, but chosen, drawn into a bond forged by sorrow and steadied by quiet strength. The fire crackled on, snow raged against the cabin, but inside, something stronger than the storm took root. For Elena, it was the first fragile certainty that she belonged. The storm did not relent. Day after day, the snow fell heavy, burying the land in silence. The road to town disappeared under drifts, the pines bowed low, and the cabin stood like a lone outpost against a world of white. Jonathan labored without pause. Each morning he split wood, his axe rising and falling in steady rhythm. Frost clung to his coat, his breath rising in sharp clouds as he hauled logs to the shed. Inside, he patched leaks, checked tools, sharpened blades, work that never ended, the kind that meant survival. Elena watched him through the window, her hand pressed to the glass. She saw the weight he carried, but also the discipline that shaped him. He did not complain, did not curse the storm. He simply endured, and in his endurance she found both awe and guilt. She refused to sit idle. Though her leg ached, she swept the floor, kept beans simmering, and mended his shirts with fingers steadier than before. But even then, a thought gnawed at her. Was she still only a guest, still only a mouth to feed? One afternoon, while Jonathan was outside battling the wind, Elena found herself staring at a small crate near the hearth. She filled it with soil from a sack and pressed a few seeds into the dirt. With care, she placed the crate on the windowsill where the weak winter sun touched it. Her hands trembled as she worked, not from pain, but from determination. Days passed, and then the green broke through the soil, tiny shoots pushing upward, fragile yet defiant against the cold. Elena sat before them, watching in wonder. They were small, almost nothing, but they were alive. Something she had planted, something that belonged. When Jonathan came in, shaking snow from his coat, he paused. His gaze fell to the window, to the green shoots trembling in the light. For a moment, his expression softened. He did not speak, only gave a slow nod before returning to his tools. But that nod was enough. Elena's chest swelled with quiet pride. For the first time, she felt less like a burden and more like a partner. The herbs were small, yes, but they were hers, and now part of the cabin, part of the life they were building in silence. That night, as the wind howled and the fire burned low, she leaned back in the chair he had built for her. Her gaze lingered on the green shoots in the wind. Against the white desolation outside, they were a promise of growth, of belonging, of a life not yet finished. For Elena, that small crate of herbs was more than food. It was proof that she had a place here, roots of her own taking hold in the heart of winter. The storm broke at last. The roads cleared slowly under the weight of thaw, and Jonathan harnessed the horses for the first trip to town in weeks. Elena climbed onto the wagon beside him, her heart hammering with each jolt of the wheels. She had not stood among strangers since the day her father mocked her in front of them all. The memory clung sharp as the winter air. The town appeared small but watchful, every doorway spilling eyes onto the street. As the wagon rolled past, heads turned. Whispers rose like smoke, drifting from one porch to the next. Elena sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, her gaze fixed on the worn boards of the general store ahead. Inside, the air was thick with heat from the stove, and thicker still with stairs. Jonathan strode forward, his broad frame steady, his voice low. Salt, nails, kerosene. The shopkeeper hesitated, his gaze sliding from Jonathan to Elena. She felt the weight of it like a hand pressing her down. Behind her, murmurs stirred. Then came the laughter. A young man leaning against the wall smirked, his voice loud enough to carry. "Didn't think you'd still have her, Hale. Thought a man with sense would have tossed her back by now." The room tensed with cruel amusement. Elena's chest burned, her face hot with shame. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But Jonathan turned, his eyes cold as iron. His voice cut through the room, steady and hard. "She is mine. That's all you need to know." Silence fell heavy. The smirk slid from the young man's face. No one dared answer. The fire snapped in the stove, the only sound daring to move. Elena's breath caught. The words rang louder than the storm, louder than the laughter that had chased her all her life. She is mine. Not pity, not shame. Choice. Her thoughts turned, unbidden, to words she had once heard from a missionary, words that had lingered though she never dared believe them true. "You are precious and honored in my sight, and because I love you." Isaiah 43:4. Tears stung her eyes. She lowered her gaze quickly, unwilling to let the room see her break. But inside, something unshakable settled into place. Jonathan turned back to the counter. The shopkeeper hurried to fill his order, hands fumbling with sacks and tins. No one spoke again until they left. Outside, the cold air rushed against her face, sharp and clean. Elena breathed deep, her chest rising as though a weight had lifted. She looked at Jonathan, but he only set the supplies in the wagon and flicked the reins. His silence was not indifference, it was finality. For the first time, she realized he had not merely sheltered her, he had claimed her, not out of charity, but out of choice, and he had spoken it before the world. The wagon wheels groaned against the ruts as they left the town behind. The air was sharp, carrying the last bite of winter, but inside, Elena felt strangely lighter. Jonathan's words still echoed in her chest. "She is mine." He had not said them to her alone, but to the world, and the world had fallen silent. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at him from the corner of her eye. He drove the team with steady focus, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not glance her way, did not speak further, but he did not need to. His silence had said enough. When they reached the cabin, Jonathan unloaded the provisions with his usual efficiency. Then, without a word, he carried in a stack of cedar boards. The scent filled the room, sharp, clean, alive. Elena watched, puzzled, as he set them on the table and began to work. The hours stretched long, the steady rasp of plane against wood filling the cabin. Shavings curled onto the floor like ribbons, the grain shining smooth under his hands. Elena sat nearby, her mending forgotten in her lap, eyes fixed on the shape forming before her. At last he stepped back. A chest stood on the table, sturdy, polished, its lid fitted true. He ran a hand across the smooth surface, then turned toward her. "It's for you," he said simply, "for your things." Her breath caught. She had so little, only a dress, a few cloths, the shawl across her shoulders. Yet this was not about possessions. This was about space, about permanence, about giving her a place that was hers alone. Slowly, she rose from her chair and crossed the room. Her fingers trembled as she traced the cedar grain, the wood warm beneath her touch. She swallowed hard, her voice breaking. No one has ever made something for me." Jonathan's eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "You belong here," he said, his voice low, certain. Her throat tightened, tears blurring her vision. She pressed her palm flat against the chest, then turned to him. He stood close, the scent of cedar clinging to him, his face shadowed by firelight, yet softened by truth. In that moment, she knew this was no act of pity. He had not taken her in out of duty, nor kept her out of stubborn pride. He had chosen her. Just as he had spoken in town, he had carved it now in wood. The cedar chest was more than a gift. It was a covenant, a promise that she was not passing through, not borrowed, not a burden. She was part of this house, this life, this man. Elena's hand left the chest and found his. She held it, firm despite her trembling. The silence that filled the cabin was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was whole, steady, and strong, like the cedar itself. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. And please leave a comment and share your feelings. Spring crept in slowly, a quiet undoing of winter's grip. The snow melted in rivulets, carving paths through the fields, revealing dark soil beneath. The pines lifted their weary branches, dripping with thaw, and the air softened with the promise of warmth. Elena stood by the window, her hands resting on the cedar chest that bore her belongings. The herbs she had planted weeks before now sprouted green and strong, their leaves catching the pale sunlight. She watched them sway gently in the breeze slipping through the cracks, and for the first time she felt that she was not merely surviving, she was living. Jonathan came in from the yard, boots caked in mud, his coat damp from melting snow. He set down his tools and brushed the water from his hat. His movements were the same as they had always been, efficient, steady, wordless. But to Elena they no longer seemed distant. She understood his silence now, the way it carried weight instead of emptiness. He paused beside her, his eyes following hers to the herbs. "They'll take root," he said simply. Elena glanced at him, startled by the quiet assurance in his tone. She nodded, her throat tight. "So will I." The words slipped out before she could stop them. Heat rose to her cheeks, and she turned away quickly. But Jonathan's hand found hers, rough and warm, closing gently around her fingers. Outside, the ground was still patchy with snow, but inside, life had already begun to bloom. The cabin smelled of cedar and earth, the scent of labor and growth. Jonathan busied himself mending a harness, but Elena knew his hand had not released hers by accident. It was another vow, unspoken yet sure. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Jonathan led her to the rise above the cabin. The ground was soft beneath their boots, the air sharp with the scent of thaw. 2 crosses stood there, weathered wood marked by years, the graves of his wife and child. Elena's chest tightened as she stood beside him. She felt the weight of his silence more keenly here, in the shadow of his loss. He bowed his head, removing his hat, his lips moving in a prayer, too quiet for her to catch. When he straightened, he turned to her. His eyes, heavy with memory, were steadier than she had ever seen them. "They were my life once," he said, "and when they were gone, I thought I had nothing left. But—" he paused, searching for words. "God still gives where we think He's taken everything away." Elena swallowed hard, her eye burning. She had been thrown aside, mocked, treated as broken. Yet standing here, at the graves of what he had lost, she felt the truth of his words. Out of loss, something new had been given, to him and to her. Jonathan's gaze lingered on the graves a moment longer, then shifted to her. He did not speak further, but his hand brushed against hers, strong and sure. They walked back down to the cabin in silence, but the silence was different now. It was not the silence of emptiness or grief. It was the silence of understanding, of lives once shattered, now binding together in something whole. That night, as Elena lay in the bed, her hand resting on the cedar chest, she whispered words she had once thought impossible. "Thank you, Lord, for not forsaking me." Outside, the night was clear, stars scattered bright across the heavens. The wind carried no storm, only the faint smell of earth waking from its long sleep. And within the cabin, two lives, once marked by loss and rejection, had begun to knit together, slow, steady, and unbreakable. By late spring, the valley had shed its cloak of white. The fields glistened with new grass, the streams ran full with miltwater, and the pines stood tall and green once more. The cabin no longer felt like an outpost against desolation, it felt like home. Elena moved with more certainty now. Her limp remained, her eye clouded, but neither ruled her. She carried buckets of water without hesitation, baked bread that filled the cabin with warmth, and tended her small herbs by the window until their leaves spilled fragrant into the air. Each task stitched her deeper into the life they shared. Jonathan worked the land with his usual endurance, repairing fences, sowing seed, and splitting logs. Yet Elena began to notice small changes, his silence softer, his gaze lingering on her longer, his steps slowing when she lagged behind. He was a man still marked by grief, but now his grief had company, and in that company it was no longer hollow. One afternoon he returned from the shed carrying a second chair, lighter than the first, its arms carved with care. He set it by the doorway where the sun spilled in, then glanced at her. "For you," he said simply. Elena lowered herself into it, the warmth of the sun across her face, the cedar smooth beneath her hands. She smiled, a small smile, but real. "You've given me more than a chair, Jonathan Hale." He did not answer, only stood beside her, but the truth shone in his eyes. The days passed, marked by labor and quiet companionship. The world outside might still whisper, still mock, but within these walls, dignity held sway. The cedar chest by her bed, the chair by the fire, the herbs in the window, all bore witness that she belonged. One evening, as the sky blazed with the colors of sunset, Elena stepped outside with him. They watched the horizon together, the land stretching vast and open, no longer threatening but filled with promise. Her voice broke the stillness, soft yet steady. "They thought giving me away was an insult, but it wasn't. It was a gift, because it brought me here." Jonathan turned to her, his expression unreadable at first, then softened by the weight of truth. A rare smile tugged at his lips, not wide, but enough to reveal what words could not. Elena reached for his hand. He took it, their fingers weaving together, roughness meeting fragility, strength meeting resolve. The words of Scripture stirred in her memory, words she had once doubted, but now felt written across her very life. "I will never leave you nor forsake you." She held them close as the sun dipped low, as Jonathan's hand tightened gently around hers, as the cabin behind them stood firm against the gathering night. Two crosses still marked the hill, silent testimony of loss. But now the cabin bore living testimony of what had risen from that loss. A life rebuilt, a bond forged not by pity but by choice, not by chance but by providence. They walked back together, side by side. The door creaked open, the firelight spilling out to greet them. Inside waited the cedar chest, the chairs, the herbs, the bread, each a sign not of survival alone, but of belonging. Elena's heart, once heavy with shame and fear, now beat with a quiet strength. She was not a burden. She was not forgotten. She was not forsaken. She was chosen. And under the wide New Mexico sky, where once there had been only silence and scorn, there now was dignity, faith, and a love that endured. Stories like Jonathan and Elena's remind us that the true frontier was never only about land, guns, or gold. It was about people, about men and women who carried wounds the world could not see, who longed for dignity, for faith, for someone to choose them when others had turned away. In their silence, their scars, and their quiet acts of love, we can glimpse something of our own journeys, moments of loss, of hope, and of grace. If this tale touched your heart, know that it is but one among many true Wild West stories. Stories where faith and endurance shaped lives as surely as the desert winds carved the land. We invite you to share your thoughts below and let us know where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe so together we can keep these timeless stories alive for generations to come.